If wishes were horses, beggars would ride. I'm sure you've heard that phrase. What does it really mean, and where does it come from? That's what you and I will investigate in this episode of History of Everyday Sayings. Steve Carter, your host for History of Everyday Sayings. I do thank you for joining me. Who is this show for? If you are a logophile, a philomath, or you're simply someone who loves history tidbits you can use to impress friends and family, this show is for you. I was listening to an audiobook a couple of nights ago, and I heard the phrase, "If wishes were horses, beggars would ride." And as so often happens when I hear an unusual phrase, I thought, I wonder where that comes from. That is what you and I will investigate in this episode of History of Everyday Sayings. We're going to begin our investigation with phrasefinder.org.uk. As so often is the case, this site is a true treasure trove of insight as to the history of various phrases and sayings. Going to this site, we find, question, what's the origin of the phrase, "If wishes were horses, beggars would ride"? To paraphrase what this site tells us, this proverb extends back in time for many, many years. A version of the expression appeared in the published works of William Camden, and that was in the 17th century. Camden was a historian and one of the select few who could write herald as his job description. He was one of 3 senior heralds of the College of Arms under Queen Elizabeth I. In 1605, Camden collected together his miscellaneous notes on English and classic history and published them under the title Remains of a Great Work Concerning Britain. Work spelled at that time W-O-R-K-E, and Britain, or Britain, B-R-I-T-A-I-N-E. He chose not to put his name on the work, claiming it was, quote, the rude rubble and outcast rubbish of a greater and more serious work. That book was later republished in several versions, and it included this proverb, quote, "If wishes were thrushes, then beggars would eat birds. If wishes were thrushes, then beggars would eat birds." Now that is not obviously the phrase that we know today, but stay with me, we will get there. Moving on, beggars aren't quite as keen as they may once have been for eating thrushes. It is clear, however, that the horses and birds versions are essentially the same proverb. Other 17th century versions also exist, including, "If wishes were butter cakes, beggars might bite." That recorded in John Ray's A Collection of English Proverbs, 1670. The first known citation of the proverb in the form that we hear it today, was in James Carmichael's Collection of Proverbs in Scots, and that read, "If wishes were horses, beggars would ride." W-A-L-D-R-Y-D-E. If wishes were horses, beggars would ride. There is some question about the exact date of Carmichael's work, but the best evidence tells us it was published in his lifetime and he died in 1628. Whether it was Carmichael or Camden who first recorded the proverb is not clear. If we go to theidioms.com, that's theidioms.com, they identify 3 bullet points that point toward the meaning of the verse. Those 3 To wish for things does not yield to anything. If just hoping and wishing for things would make it happen, then even the poorest of all people would have everything they desire. And finally, one should work in order to get things instead of wishing for them. This site tells us the origin in 1605, William Camden's literary work, Remains of a Greater Work Concerning Britain, used this phrase, although in a slightly different version to what it is now. James Carmichael used another version in 1628. John Ray used another modified version in 1670. And finally, the version that is closest to the one in use today was introduced by James Kelly in 1721. The modern-day version has come about from all of the above and perhaps a few more variations of that same phrase. They have all meant the same since the very first. I normally am hesitant to use Wikipedia for a variety of reasons, but in this particular case, there is some additional information that is worthy of our attention. It tells us, if wishes were horses, beggars would ride, is a proverb and nursery rhyme, first recorded about 1628 in a collection of Scottish proverbs, which suggests if wishing could make things happen, then even the most destitute people would have everything they wanted. It tells us it actually was a folk song. Common newer versions include, if wishes were horses, beggars would ride. If turnips were watches, I'd wear one by my side. If ifs and ands were pots and pans, there'd be no work for tinkers' hands. Yet another version, if wishes were horses, then beggars would ride. If turnips were swords, I'd have one by my side. If ifs and ands were pots and pans, there would be no work for tinkers' hands. So I do think it's clear the roots, the origins of this phrase goes back to the early to mid 1600s. While we don't hear it frequently these days, it is something that from time to time we will hear. And like so many phrases, there is wisdom in the words and in the meaning. There's one more item I would like to share. This from ifwishes.com. ifwishes.com. This website is actually associated with a salon. And the lady who is the proprietor tells us, before you read too much into the name of my salon, let me explain. First of all, it is an old nursery rhyme from the 1600s. Here's what the esteemed and scholarly internet is saying about the meaning. If wishes were horses, beggars would ride is an English language proverb and nursery rhyme, first recorded about 1628 in a collection of Scottish proverbs, which suggests if wishing could make things happen, then even the most destitute people would have everything they wanted. This she identified from Wikipedia. She goes on, this is interesting and all, but on a much more personal note, If Wishes Were Horses was the name of a vintage clothing store in downtown Cleveland, Ohio in the 80s. I loved that store. It has long since closed, and the building where this shop resided in the beautiful old arcade, a stunning example of Beaux Arts, and I may not have the pronunciation of that just right, that's B-E-A-U-X. Beaux Arts architecture, built in 1890, has since become the home of a corporate hotel and a smattering of offices and generic shops. Sigh. Anyway, If Wishes Were Horses, the vintage clothing shop, was a special place for me as a punk, rock, goth chick growing up in the 80s in the Midwest when it wasn't yet cool to be alternative. I bought some great things from that shop. The woman who owned it, she was way cool too. So I was just in love with the whole scene. So, all of those years ago, I remember saying to myself that if I ever had a shop of my own, I would name it If Wishes Were Horses. That place was so special and important in my life for many reasons, but mostly because it gave me hope. Hope that there was beauty and interesting things everywhere, even in industrial Cleveland. That hope inspired me and was the catalyst for me to leave and see some more of the world. This is my third salon, so if I wasn't going to use this name now, then when? And that is how If Wishes Were Horses was born. I'll have all of the sources I use for this investigation linked in the show notes. If you're not yet following the History of Everyday Saying show, there is no better time than now to do that. You can, of course, do so where you get your podcasts. If you would like to explore previous episodes of this show, visit us at stressreliefradio.com and click on the podcast tab. stressreliefradio.com and click on the podcast tab. If you have a phrase or a saying you would like investigated, or you would like to be in touch for any reason, email me at cartermethod@gmail.com. Thank you again for joining me. Until our next visit together, I'm your host, Steve Carter, wishing for you and your loved ones blessings in abundance.